Society loves a train wreck, but they love a spinster even more. Arthur Pendleton, the Earl of Clevedon, was London's favourite punchline. A stuttering, limping recluse who preferred the cold brass of his pocket watches to the waltzes of Mayfair. Genevieve Hastings was the diamond who stayed on the shelf too long. Bitter, sharp-tongued, and secretly penniless, she was practically radioactive. They were the bottom of the aristocratic barrel, until the night she walked past a dozen eligible dukes and asked the village idiot to dance. Clara stood in the centre of the London parlour. Dust sheets were already draped over the armchairs, transforming the furniture into lumpy ghosts of a life she could no longer afford. Thomas was dead. A carriage accident on a rain-slicked road outside Bath had ended his life, and with it, the exhausting charade of their marriage. He had left her a widow at 26. He had also left her a staggering collection of unpaid tailor's bills, IOUs held by men with broken noses and sharp knuckles, and a single, unentailed property in the unforgiving hills of Yorkshire, Ashdown. 8 seasons. 8 years of standing against silk-papered walls, smiling until her jaw ached, pretending she didn't know her father had gambled away the family estate before putting a pistol in his mouth. Society didn't know the extent of the rot, but they smelled it. They smelled the lack of a dowry like blood in the water. "You look bored, Miss Hastings, or perhaps merely tragic." Now she tied the ribbons of her bonnet. The carriage waiting outside was not hers. It was hired, and it smelled faintly of stale tobacco and wet wool. She had exactly £42, 6 shillings, and a collection of mourning gowns to her name. London was a city for the wealthy, the climbing, and the predatory. She was none of those things anymore. She was just a woman with a piece of paper and a desperate need to disappear. 200 miles north, Caelan Pendleton, the Duke of Westford, stood by the roaring hearth of his library at Oakhaven. His estate was a masterpiece of modern agricultural efficiency. His tenant farms were orderly, his ledgers were balanced to the farthing, and his temper was currently fraying at the edges. "She is actually coming," his mother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, observed from her wingback chair. She held a cup of tea, the china impossibly delicate against her age-spotted hands. "She is a fool," Caelan replied. He nudged a burning log with the toe of his Hessian boot. A shower of sparks flew up the chimney. Thomas stripped Ashdown of anything valuable 5 years ago. He sold the timber. He sold the good grazing land to my steward. The main house is practically a ruin. What does Clara think she's going to do? Plant roses? Beatrice took a slow sip of her tea. I remember her as a very quiet girl, observant. She used to sit in the corners at Almack's and watch people. She didn't flutter. Fluttering or not, she cannot farm, Mother. She is a woman raised on drawing-room gossip and watercolour paints. Ashdown is 5,000 acres of chalk and clay, burdened by generational debt. Caelan turned away from the fire, his expression hard. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a relentlessly pragmatic one. He had spent 10 years dragging his own duchy out of the financial mire his father had left behind. He knew the cost of bad land. It cost sleep. It cost sanity. "I give her 3 months, Caelan stated, walking toward his desk. "The damp will get into her bones. The creditors will find out where she has gone. She will write to me, begging me to take it off her hands for a fraction of its worth. And I will because I pity her. But the estate will break her first." "Perhaps," Beatrice said softly. "But hunger is a remarkable tutor, Caelan." Clara arrived at Ashdown 3 days later. The journey had bruised her spine and rattled her teeth. When the hired carriage finally lurched up the long, winding drive, she pressed her face against the cold glass. Ashdown was a carcass. The great iron gates were rusted open, one hinge entirely snapped. The drive was choked with aggressive, knee-high thistles. The manor house itself, a sprawling Elizabethan structure of dark stone, loomed against the grey sky like a rotting tooth. Several of the tall chimney stacks had crumbled. The windows on the west wing were boarded up, the wood grey and splintering. The carriage jerked to a halt. The driver did not offer to help her down. He merely hauled her 2 modest trunks onto the gravel and waited for his coin. Clara paid him from her shrinking purse and stood alone in the biting wind as the carriage clattered away. There was no welcoming committee, no staff lined up on the steps. She pushed open the heavy oak front door. It groaned, the sound echoing through the cavernous, empty hall. The air inside was colder than the air outside. It smelled of mildew, old ash, and abandonment. Clara walked into the grand foyer. The floorboards were dull, thick with dust. Above her, a massive chandelier hung dangerously low, stripped of its crystal drops. The plaster on the ceiling was peeling, falling in damp clumps to the floor. She walked into the drawing room. The furniture that remained was covered in sheets, much like her parlour in London, but these sheets were speckled with mouse droppings. The fireplace was cold and vast. Clara kept her heavy woolen pelisse on. She sat down on a dust-sheeted chair, the springs groaning in protest. She looked at her hands. They were pale, uncalloused, adorned only by a thin gold wedding band that felt heavier than the house itself. Caelan was right about one thing. Ashdown was a ruin. But as Clara sat in the freezing, silent room, a strange, sharp sensation bloomed in her chest. It wasn't despair. Despair was what she had felt in London, waiting for the debt collectors to knock. Here there was no one to judge her, no one to pity her. The worst had already happened. She had hit the absolute bottom of her life, and the floor beneath her was solid stone. "Right," Clara whispered to the empty room, her breath plumed in the frigid air. "Let us see what is left." The next morning, Clara did not ring for tea. There was no one to ring for, and there was no tea. She drank water from the courtyard pump, which tasted faintly of iron, and ate a stale heel of bread she had packed in her trunk. She found the estate office in a cramped room off the kitchen corridors. It was a disaster. Stacks of ledgers were piled haphazardly on a scarred desk. Drawers were pulled out, overflowing with unpaid invoices, angry letters from merchants, and damp, illegible receipts. Clara spent the first 3 days in that room. She wrapped herself in 2 blankets and worked systematically through the chaos. She had never been taught accounting. Her education had consisted of French, the pianoforte, and how to pour tea without splashing the saucer. But numbers were logical. Debt was a simple matter of subtraction, and Clara learned fast. By the end of the 3rd day, her fingers were stained black with ink, her eyes ached, and she had a complete picture of her ruin. Thomas hadn't just neglected the estate. He had bled it. The tenant farms were in arrears because the roofs of their cottages had caved in and their crops had rotted in undrained fields. The local bailiff, a man named Cobb, had been collecting half-rents in cash and keeping the difference, reporting the tenants as defaulting. On the 4th morning, Clara sent a boy from the village to fetch Mr. Cobb. Cobb arrived 2 hours late. He was a thick-set man with a florid face, wearing a coat that was entirely too fine for a bailiff on a bankrupt estate. He didn't take off his hat when he entered the office. He looked at Clara, sitting behind the desk in her morning dress, with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "You sent for me, Lady Clara?" he drawled, leaning heavily against the door frame. "I did," Clara said. She did not look up from the ledger immediately. She let the silence stretch. It was a trick she had learned watching older women cut down arrogant men in London ballrooms. Silence was a weapon. When Cobb finally shifted his weight uncomfortably, she looked up. "I have been reviewing the accounts, Mr. Cobb," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any aristocratic lilt. "Well now, my lady, those books are a bit of a tangle," Cobb said, offering a patronizing smile. Best leave the ciphering to me. It's a man's work, keeping an estate in line. Clara turned a page. You recorded the Miller farm as defaulting for the past 3 quarters. Yet I found a receipt in the bottom drawer, signed by you, acknowledging a payment of £12 from Miller in November. Cobb's smile faltered. His ruddy face tightened. That was a partial payment. Barely covered the interest on his arrears. The interest, Clara repeated. She closed the ledger. The thump of the heavy leather cover sounded like a gavel in the small room. You are dismissed, Mr. Cobb. Cobb blinked, then barked a harsh laugh. Dismissed? You can't dismiss me. Your husband put me in charge. Who's going to collect your rents? Who's going to manage the planting? You? A soft little city widow? He took a step towards their desk, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. You need me. Without me, these tenants will eat you alive. Clara did not flinch. She looked at his boots, which were clean, and then at her own, which were already caked in ash-down mud. I need a bailiff, Clara said evenly. I do not need a thief. You have until noon to remove your belongings from the bailiff's cottage. If you are still on my land by 1 o'clock, I will send to York for the magistrate and have you arrested for embezzlement. The receipt is in my possession. Good day, Mr. Cobb. He stared at her, the bluster draining out of him, replaced by a sullen fury. He opened his mouth to argue, saw the dead, unyielding look in her eyes, and thought better of it. He spat on the floorboard and walked out. Clara exhaled a shaky breath once he was gone. Her hands were trembling. She hid them under the desk. Firing Cobb was necessary, but it left a gaping hole. Spring was approaching. The fields needed turning. The sheep needed shearing. She had no bailiff, no labourers, and no money to hire them. She needed capital, immediately. Clara walked out of the office and began a methodical tour of the manor. She wasn't looking at the architecture, she was looking at the materials. She walked up to the ruined west wing. The roof had caved in, but the dome above the old conservatory was clad in thick, heavy lead. Lead was valuable. She walked through the grand dining room. The walls were lined with 200-year-old oak panelling, intricately carved. Oak was valuable. She went to the library. Thomas had sold the first editions, but the heavy mahogany doors remained. She spent the next week riding a draft horse into the neighbouring towns. She did not wear a riding habit. She wore her heaviest wool dress and a man's heavy riding cloak she had found in a closet. She visited builders, scrap-yards, and timber merchants. She haggled. When they tried to lowball her because she was a woman, she simply turned and walked towards the door. They always called her back. By the end of March, the manor house of Ashdown looked like it had been sacked by an invading army. The lead was stripped from the roofs, replaced by cheap, ugly slate. The oak panelling was gone, leaving bare, draughty plaster. The grand mahogany doors were replaced with rough pine. Even the heavy iron gates at the entrance had been hauled away to a foundry. But in Clara's iron cash box beneath her bed, there was £400. It was enough. She walked down to the village tavern on a Tuesday evening. The tavern was filled with her tenants, hard, worn men who looked at her with deep suspicion. They expected her to demand the back rent. They expected her to evict them. Clara stood in the centre of the smoky room. She didn't clear her throat. She just started speaking, her voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. Mr. Cobb is gone, she announced. The room went dead silent. He was stealing from me, and he was stealing from you. Your arrears are wiped clean. We start fresh tomorrow. A murmur rippled through the room. A tall, gaunt man named Miller stood up. Start fresh with what, my lady? We ain't got seed, we ain't got draft horses, the drainage ditches are choked. I have bought seed, Clara said. It arrives on Thursday from York. I have hired 2 teams of horses. Tomorrow at dawn, anyone who wants to keep their tenancy will meet me at the south fields. We are clearing the ditches. I will pay standard day wages for the labour, in cash, at the end of every week. Miller eyed her skeptically. "You're paying us to fix your ditches? I am paying you to make the land workable so you don't starve next winter, Mr. Miller." Clara replied sharply. "I cannot lower the rents. I cannot offer you charity. But I can offer you work, and I can offer you seed. If you do not want it, pack your bags tonight." She turned and walked out of the tavern, the silence heavy behind her. The next morning, at dawn, a cold drizzle was falling over Ashdown. Clara stood at the edge of the south field, the mud sucking at her boots. She wore a shortened skirt, thick woolen stockings, and a man's waxed canvas jacket. For 10 minutes she stood alone. She felt a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Had she miscalculated? Then, over the ridge, a figure appeared. It was Miller, carrying a heavy iron spade over his shoulder. Behind him came another man, then 3 more. Soon 20 men stood at the edge of the choke ditch, looking at the muddy, freezing water. Clara didn't give a speech. She picked up a shovel, walked to the edge of the ditch, drove the blade into the muck, and threw the first load of black mud onto the bank. The men watched her for a moment. Then Miller spat into his hands, stepped down into the mud beside her, and drove his spade into the earth. April was a crucible. The Yorkshire spring did not arrive with gentle breezes and blooming daffodils. It arrived with biting sleet, gale-force winds, and mud so thick it felt like wet cement. Kylan Pendleton, Duke of Westford, sat in his immaculate study, a ledger open before him. The yields from his eastern farms were promising. His new crop rotation was working flawlessly. Yet his mind kept wandering to the ragged estate bordering his own. He hadn't heard a word from Clara Highsmith. 3 times in the past month, he had expected a letter bearing the Ashdown seal, filled with tearful pleas for a loan or an offer of sale. Nothing had come. His steward, Mr. Hayes, had mentioned offhandedly that the timber merchants in York had been flush with old oak, and that scrap iron was suddenly cheap in the village. But Kylan hadn't connected the dots. "She must be starving," Kylan muttered, closing his ledger. It wasn't cruelty that made him say it. It was an ingrained understanding of economics. A woman alone, with no capital, could not run an estate. It was a mathematical impossibility. "Are you talking to yourself again, Kylan?" Beatrice asked, gliding into the room. "I am riding to Ashdown," Kylan said, standing up. "It has been 2 months. She is likely freezing to death in that ruin. I will offer her 5,000 for the land. It is more than it's worth, but it will allow her to return to London and live quietly." "How generous of you," Beatrice said, her tone unreadable. "Do wear your heavy cloak. The wind is sharp today." Kylan rode out with his steward, expecting a grim task. He expected to find a weeping widow, surrounded by the decay of her husband's failures. As they crossed the property line onto Ashdown land, Kylan frowned. The rusted iron gates were missing entirely. The stone pillars stood bare. "Thieves, likely," Mr. Hayes noted, looking at the empty hinges. "Scavenge the iron." They rode up the long drive. The aggressive thistles had been violently hacked back, the brush piled and burned. It wasn't pretty, but it was clear. As they neared the manor, Kylan reined in his horse, staring. The house looked terrible. The elegant lead domes were gone, replaced by slate. The grand entrance doors were missing. It looked like a hollowed-out skull. "Good God," Kylan murmured. "She has been plundered." They rode around the side of the house toward the estate offices, but a sound caught Kylan's attention. Shouting, the bleating of sheep. A lot of sheep. He turned his horse toward the grazing pastures behind the manor. As they crested the hill, Kylan stopped dead. Down in the valley, the holding pens were full. The sheep were not the scrawny, disease-ridden flock Thomas had left behind. They were healthy, heavily fleeced, and loud. And in the center of the muddy paddock, surrounded by swearing laborers and panicked animals, was Clara Highsmith. Caelan barely recognized her. She was not wearing mourning black. She was wearing a faded brown skirt that had been roughly hacked off at the ankles, revealing heavy, mud-caked boots. A thick, oversized canvas coat swamped her frame. Her hair, which he remembered being meticulously styled in London, was tied back in a harsh knot, escaping in damp tendrils around her face. She held a long shepherd's crook and was currently using it to barricade a gate against a surging tide of wool. "Hold the line, Miller!" Clara shouted, her voice hoarse and raw. "If they breach that gate, we'll be chasing them until midnight. Get the shearers ready." Caelan sat on his horse, stunned. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't freezing in a parlor. She was covered in chalk, mud, and sheep grease, barking orders at men who were twice her size. And the men were listening. Caelan nudged his horse forward, riding down the slope. As he approached the fence, Clara saw him. She didn't gasp. She didn't frantically try to smooth her hair or look ashamed of her state. She merely wiped a streak of mud off her cheek with the back of a filthy glove and walked over to the fence, leaning her elbows on the top rail. She looked exhausted. There were deep purple shadows under her eyes, and her skin was wind-burned. But there was a hard, flinty light in her eyes that Caelan had never seen before. "Your Grace," Clara said, her breath pluming in the cold air. She didn't curtsy. "To what do I owe the pleasure? If you are here to complain about the smell, I suggest you ride upwind." Caelan stared at her. He looked at the pens. "Where did you get these sheep, Lady Clara?" "I bought them," she replied simply. "With what?" Caelan asked, genuinely baffled. "Thomas left you nothing but debt." Clara offered a tight, humorless smile. She gestured back toward the manor house with a flick of her head. "I sold the roof. I sold the paneling. I sold the doors and the gates. A house is just a box, Your Grace. The land is the only thing that pays. I bought seed, and I bought this flock from a breeder in Cumbria who was desperate for cash." Caelan's mind raced. She had stripped her own house. She had gutted her shelter to feed her soil. It was reckless. It was mad. It was exactly what he would have done. "The soil here is too poor for heavy grazing," Caelan found himself saying, shifting into the familiar territory of agronomy. "You will exhaust the pastures by July. I am not keeping them until July," Clara said, turning to watch Miller wrestle a massive ram toward the shearing station. "I am shearing them now. Wool prices are up because of the blockades. I will sell the fleece to the mills in Bradford next week, and I will sell the sheep to the butchers in York before they can overgraze. A short-term investment to fund the summer planting." Caelan was silent. He looked at the muddy hem of her skirt. He looked at the blister on her thumb, visible through a tear in her glove. He had come here to offer her a lifeline, fully expecting her to drown. Instead, she was building a raft out of her own floorboards. "You are working like a common laborer," Caelan said quietly, his voice losing its cynical edge. "I am an uncommon debtor," Clara shot back. "Labor is free. Dignity is expensive. I have chosen which one I can afford to lose." She turned her head, looking him directly in the eyes. The intense, unblinking contact made something uncomfortable twist in Caelan's chest. "Did you come here to offer me charity, Duke? Or did you come to watch the ruin you predicted?" Caelan opened his mouth, then closed it. The £5,000 he was going to offer her suddenly felt like an insult. He realized, with a jolt of profound clarity, that if he offered her money right now, she would likely hit him with the shepherd's crook. "I came to see my neighbor," Caelan lied smoothly. He tipped his hat. "Your renovations on the manor are quite aggressive, Lady Clara, but your flock looks healthy. They will look better when they are turned into coin," Clara said, turning her back on him. Now, if you will excuse me, the shearers charge by the hour, and I am not paying them to watch me gossip with a duke." She walked back into the fray, her heavy boots sinking into the mud. Caelan watched her go. "Shall we make the offer, Your Grace?" Mr. Hayes asked softly beside him. "No!" Caelan said, his eyes fixed on Clara as she hoisted a gate shut. "No, Mr. Hayes. I do not think Lady Clara is for sale. Let us go home." As Caelan rode back to Oakhaven, the cynical certainty he had carried for months was gone. Ashdown was not breaking her. Ashdown was forging her into something sharp, hard, and entirely unpredictable. And heaven help him. Caelan wanted to see what happened next. June arrived with a dry, suffocating heat that baked the Yorkshire clay into cracked porcelain. The mud of spring hardened into jagged ridges that bruised the feet of the draught horses. Clara did not plant wheat. Wheat was a gentleman's crop, requiring patience and good soil. Ashdown possessed neither. Instead, she had taken the entirety of her sheep profits and poured it into flax. It was a massive, terrifying gamble. Flax required relentless labor. It had to be weeded by hand, the soil kept perfectly loose. But the linen mills in Bradford were starving for raw material due to the blockades in Europe. If she could pull a crop from the exhausted dirt of Ashdown, the payout would be astronomical. If the crop failed, she would be destitute by September. She lived in the fields. She abandoned her corsets, trading them for a thick linen shift and her chopped brown skirt. Her skin, once the prized, translucent white of a London debutante, turned the color of weak tea. The bridge of her nose peeled. Her fingernails were permanently rimmed with black earth. Caelan Pendleton watched it happen from the saddle of his gelding, sitting atop the ridge that divided their properties. He came every 3 days. He told himself he was monitoring the boundary lines. He told himself he was keeping an eye on a reckless neighbor. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. He was entirely captivated. Below him, the southern fields of Ashdown had transformed. A sea of pale, delicate blue flowers swayed in the dry wind. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a vast lake of color against the grim stone of the ruined manor house in the distance. And moving through the center of that blue sea was Clara, a wide-brimmed straw hat tied under her chin, checking the stalks for aphids. Caelan nudged his horse down the slope. The animal picked its way carefully through the boundary stream and up the bank onto Ashdown land. Clara didn't look up until the shadow of the horse fell over her. She squinted against the glaring sun, a stalk of flax crushed between her dirty fingers. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was drier than the soil. She did not stop working, her hands moving expertly down the stem of the plant, checking for rot at the root. "You planted flax," Caelan observed, halting his horse a few feet away. "You have keen eyes, Duke, or perhaps you merely recognized the color blue." Caelan ignored the barb. He swung down from the saddle, his polished riding boots sinking slightly into the soft, tilled earth. "It is a greedy crop, Clara. It strips the soil of nutrients faster than tobacco. You will ruin this field for the next 3 years. Clara finally stopped. She stood up straight, pressing a hand to the small of her back. The movement pulled the coarse fabric of her shift tight against her chest. Caelan looked away, fixing his gaze deliberately on the horizon. "I am not farming for 3 years from now, Caelan," she said, dropping the formality entirely. It was a slip, born of exhaustion, but neither of them corrected it. "I am farming for August. If I do not have £2,000 by the autumn quarter day, the Crown takes the estate for back taxes. I will worry about the soil next year, when I actually own it." Caelan frowned. 2,000? Thomas's debts were heavy, but the taxes on this acreage cannot be that high. "Thomas," Clara said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth, "did not pay the property taxes for 4 years. The Crown is remarkably unforgiving regarding arrears. They want gold, not excuses." She turned back to the plants. Caroline watched the sharp line of her shoulder blades move beneath her thin shirt. She was terrifyingly fragile, a sheer force of will holding a ruined estate together with blistered hands. "I could lend you the capital," Caroline said. The words left his mouth before his pragmatic mind could stop them. It was a terrible business decision. You did not lend money to unproven farmers on ruined land. Clara went entirely still. She turned her head, her hazel eyes locking onto his. There was no gratitude in them. There was only a cold, hard pride. "No, it is not charity," Caroline insisted, stepping closer. The smell of crushed stems and hot earth hung heavy between them. "It is a business loan, 6% interest, drawn up by my solicitor. You can hire proper laborers instead of breaking your own back." "I said no." Clara stepped toward him. She was a full foot shorter, but she seemed to consume the space around her. "I know how loans work, Caroline. If my crop fails, you take the land. You become my landlord. I will not trade one master for another. I will pull every weed in this field with my teeth before I owe you a single farthing." Caroline stared down at her. She was filthy. She smelled of sweat and dust. She was the most magnificent creature he had ever seen. "You are stubborn to the point of suicide," he said, his voice dropping to a low, rough register. "And you are accustomed to buying everything you look at." Clara countered, her breath hitching slightly as he stepped into her space. "But you cannot buy this, and you cannot buy me." "I am not trying to buy you, Clara." "Then get off my land," she whispered. Caroline held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment. The air between them crackled, thick and heavy. He wanted to shake her. He wanted to pull her against him until she stopped fighting. He did neither. He turned on his heel, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking back. Clara watched him go. Her hands were shaking. She wiped them on her skirt, turned back to the flax, and began to pull the weeds again. July brought the heat, and it brought Mr. Harwood. He arrived in a hired carriage, a stout man in a wool suit entirely unsuited for the sweltering Yorkshire summer. He smelled of heavy pomade and London smog. Clara received him in the grand foyer, which was still missing its doors. The summer breeze blew straight through the house, carrying the scent of drying mud. Harwood did not take off his hat. He surveyed the stripped walls and the missing chandelier with a sneer. "Lady Clara," he said, pulling a folded piece of heavy parchment from his breast pocket. "I represent the firm of Sterling and Cross, London." Clara stood by the cold, empty fireplace. "I am aware of my husband's tailors. I wrote to them in March, stating they would be paid in September." "I am not here about waistcoats," Harwood said smoothly. He walked forward, his boots clicking sharply on the dusty floorboards. "Before your husband's unfortunate demise, he engaged in a rather aggressive game of hazard at White's. He lost heavily. When he could not pay, he signed this." Harwood held out the paper. Clara didn't take it. She leaned forward and read the heavy, jagged script of Thomas's handwriting. It was a promissory note for £3,000, guaranteed against the deed of Ashdown estate. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath Clara's feet. A cold sweat broke out on her neck despite the sweltering heat. 3,000. It was impossible. Even with the flax, even with a flawless harvest, she would clear perhaps 2,000. "The note matured yesterday," Harwood stated, tapping the paper. "My firm demands immediate settlement, in full. If you cannot provide it, I have the authority to seize the deed and begin the auction of the land." Clara's mind raced, hitting brick walls at every turn. She had survived the starvation of spring. She had survived the grueling labor of summer. She was weeks away from the harvest. And Thomas, from the grave, was reaching up to drag her back down to hell. "I need until September," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The harvest. The harvest is irrelevant. Harwood interrupted. The debt is mature. You have 24 hours to produce the funds, or the Sheriff of York will remove you from the premises. He smiled, a greasy, satisfied lifting of his lips. He turned and walked out the door, back into his carriage. Clara stood alone in the draughty hall. She did not cry. Crying was useless. She walked into the estate office, sat at her desk, and looked at her ledgers. She was dead. The estate had finally broken her. An hour later, the sharp clatter of hooves broke the silence. Caelan strode through the missing front doors without knocking. He was not wearing his formal riding coat. His shirt was open at the collar, his hair wind-blown. He looked furious. He found her in the office, staring blankly at a wall. The magistrate in York sent word to my steward, Caelan said, his voice hard as iron. He threw his riding crop onto her desk. A creditor from London filed a petition for seizure against Ashdown this morning. £3,000. Clara didn't look at him. News travels fast when there is a carcass to pick. Why didn't you tell me? He demanded. I did not know, Clara said quietly. Thomas kept his gambling debts entirely separate from the estate ledgers. He hid it. Caelan paced the length of the small room, his boots loud on the wood. Harwood is a shark. He specializes in swooping in on widows and seizing land for a fraction of its worth. He will have you out by tomorrow night. I know. Clara closed the ledger. I am packing my trunks. Caelan stopped pacing. He looked at her, his jaw tight. You are giving up? I am out of moves, Caelan. She finally looked up, and he saw the absolute exhaustion in her eyes. The fires was gone, replaced by a hollow defeat. I cannot pull £3,000 out of thin air. I cannot sell the flax before it is harvested. I fought. I lost. No, Caelan said. The word was a physical command in the room. He walked over to the desk, leaned his hands flat on the scarred wood, and leaned down until his face was inches from hers. You are not packing. You are not leaving. Unless you have £3,000 in your saddlebags, I have no choice. I do not carry that much cash. Caelan said evenly. But my bank in York can draft a note by sunset. I will buy the debt from Harwood. Clara shook her head, a bitter smile twisting her lips. We had this conversation in the Flaxfield, Duke. I will not be your charity case. I will not be your tenant. It is not charity! Caelan snarled, his patience finally snapping. God, you are an infuriating woman. I don't want your debt, Clara. I want your water. Clara blinked, the fog of defeat parting slightly. My water? The river wire, Caelan said, standing up straight. His mind was clicking into the ruthless, calculating gear that had made him the wealthiest duke in the north. It forms the eastern boundary of Ashdown, but the deepest channel, the only part of the river with enough current to turn an industrial water wheel, lies entirely on your side of the property line. I want to build a textile mill on my side, but I need access to your channel to power it. Clara stared at him. Her mind, trained over the last 6 months to hunt for leverage, snapped to attention. You want to buy a strip of the riverbank. I will buy a 20-foot strip of land along the wire, spanning a half-mile, just enough for me to lay a diversion channel to my mill. Clara stood up. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. She walked to the large, hand-drawn map of Ashdown tacked to the wall. She traced the line of the river. That water is the only reliable irrigation source for my eastern pastures, she said slowly. You will still have access to the river. Caelan countered. I just need the deep channel rights. £3,000 is an absurd price for a half-mile of rocky riverbank, Clara noted, turning back to him. It is. Caelan agreed easily. It is highway robbery. But you need £3,000 right now, and I need that water by next spring. We are both over a barrel." They stared at each other across the cramped office. It was a brutal, unsentimental negotiation. He was saving her life, but he was doing it by exploiting her desperation to get something he had coveted for years. And she loved him for it. She loved that he respected her enough to bargain with her rather than coddle her. 4,000, Clara said. Kylan narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" £4,000. Clara repeated, her chin lifting. 3,000 to pay Harwood. 1,000 to fund the harvesting crews for the flax. You want my water, Kaylin? You pay a premium for rushing the sale. Kaylin let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. It was a sound of pure, disbelieving delight. She was backed against a cliff, staring down a firing squad, and she was haggling for a better price. 3,500, Kaylin countered, leaning against the desk. And you grant my surveyors access to the bank tomorrow. 3,800, and your surveyors do not trample the oat field on their way down. Done, Kaylin said. He didn't offer his hand. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Clara didn't back away. The air in the room was suddenly stifling. Kaylin reached out and caught a loose strand of hair that had escaped her severe knot, tucking it gently behind her ear. His fingers brushed against her sunburned cheek. It was a jarringly tender gesture against the harshness of their conversation. "I will send my solicitor with the contract and the bank draft before dinner," Kaylin said, his voice dropping. His thumb lingered on her jaw. "Do not pack your trunks, Clara." "I won't," she breathed. Kaylin stepped back, the heat between them lingering like a physical weight, and left the room. Clara leaned back against the map, her knees suddenly weak, and let out a long, shaking breath. Ashdown was safe. August was violent. The harvesting of flax was not a gentle reaping. The plants had to be pulled entirely by the roots to preserve the length of the fibers. Clara hired 50 men and women from the surrounding villages with Kaylin's money. She worked alongside them. For 2 weeks, the fields of Ashdown were a battlefield. Backs screamed in protest, hands bled, the sun beat down without mercy. Once pulled, the flax had to be tied in bundles and submerged in shallow, stagnant ponds to rot, a process called retting, which loosened the fibers from the stalks. The smell was atrocious. A foul, sulphurous stench hung over the entire estate. Kaylin rode over once during the retting. He smelled the estate a mile before he saw it. He found Clara standing knee-deep in a murky pond, using a long wooden pole to weigh down a massive bundle of rotting flax with heavy stones. She was covered in muck, smelling like a dead swamp. He didn't say a word. He simply tied his horse, rolled up the sleeves of his pristine linen shirt, waded into the foul water beside her, and grabbed the other end of the pole. They worked in silence for 3 hours, side by side in the stench and the mud. When they finished, Kaylin washed his hands in a bucket of well water, bowed to her, and rode home. It was the most romantic thing any man had ever done for her. By the end of August, the retting was complete. The fibers were dried, scutched, and bundled. The wagons from the Bradford mills arrived on a Tuesday. The mill owners, desperate for raw materials, had sent their own men to collect the crop. Clara stood in the courtyard of the ruined manor. She watched as bundle after bundle of pale golden fibre was loaded onto the heavy drays. The mill agent, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Finch, stood beside her with a portable desk and a strongbox. "Finest quality I've seen all year, Lady Clara," Finch muttered, scratching figures into a ledger. "The fibres are long and strong. We'll pay a premium." Clara did not smile. She just watched the wagons. "How much, Mr. Finch?" Finch finished his calculations. He looked up, a begrudging respect in his eyes. £6,200, paid in bank drafts drawn on the Bank of England. Clara closed her eyes. 6,000. She paid Miller and the labourers their final wages with substantial bonuses. She watched the wagons roll down the drive, kicking up dust in the late summer heat. Then she walked into the estate office. She opened the master ledger. With a steady hand, she turned to the page outlining the debts of Thomas Highsmith. She drew a thick, heavy black line through the total. Ashdown was solvent. Ashdown was hers. 3 days later, Caelan hosted the annual harvest ball at Oakhaven. It was a grand affair, the estate glowing with thousands of candles. The carriages of the local gentry lined the immense circular drive. Caelan stood near the sweeping staircase, a glass of champagne in his hand, feeling entirely detached from the glittering crowd. He wore severe black evening wear, his cravat tied with mathematical precision. He was answering a question from Lord Hastings about crop rotation when the room seemed to go terribly quiet. Caelan turned toward the entrance. Clara stood in the doorway. She did not look like a ghost anymore, and she did not look like a field labourer. She had not bought a new gown. She still refused to waste money on frivolity, but she had altered one of her mourning dresses. The heavy black crepe was gone, replaced by a deep, rich bronze silk that she had found in a trunk. It was unadorned, lacking the lace and jewels the other women wore. But it didn't matter. She wore the dress like armor. Her skin was still tanned, a stark contrast to the pale, powdered women in the room. Her hair was swept up in a simple, elegant style. She moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, the physical grace of a woman who knew exactly how much she weighed in the world. The crowd parted for her. The whispers began immediately. Gossip about her ruined house, her dirty hands, her bizarre behavior. Clara ignored them entirely. Her hazel eyes scanned the room, locked onto Caelan, and she began to walk toward him. Caelan handed his glass to a passing footman without looking. His heart was hammering against his ribs with the force of a cavalry charge. She stopped in front of him. "Your Grace," she said, her voice dropping into that low, husky register that she only used when they were alone. "Lady Clara," Caelan replied, his voice equally quiet. He offered his arm. "Will you walk with me?" She placed her hand on his sleeve. Her fingers were no longer blistered, but he could feel the hardened calluses through the silk of his jacket. It was the most exquisite touch he had ever felt. He led her out of the crowded ballroom, through the towering French doors, and onto the stone terrace. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. They stood by the stone balustrade, looking out over the dark expanse of the Oakhaven lawns. The Bradford wagons arrived, Clara said, staring out at the darkness. "I heard," Caelan said. "Finch is a loud man when he's pleased. £6,000, plus the remainder of the sheep money and the timber sales." Clara turned her head to look at him. The moonlight caught the sharp, beautiful angles of her face. "Mr. Higgins ran the valuation this morning. Factoring in the cleared debts, the capitalized soil, and the secured water rights." She paused, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "Ashdown is worth roughly £20,000. Caelan calculated the numbers in his head. He looked at her, entirely awestruck, acre for acre. Caelan said softly, "Your estate is currently yielding more profit than mine." "I know," Clara said. "You gutted your house." "I did." "You smelled like a swamp for 2 weeks." "I did." Caelan turned fully toward her. He reached out, taking both of her calloused hands in his. "I told my mother in January that Ashdown would break you by spring." Clara looked down at their joined hands, then up into his eyes. "And what does your mother say now?" "She says," Caelan murmured, stepping closer, that I am a fool if I let you go back to that ruined house alone. He didn't ask for permission. He pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her waist. Clara leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his jacket. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss of the drawing room. It was desperate, fierce, and tasting of the earth and survival. Clara kissed him back with the same ruthless energy she had used to drag her land back from the dead, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Caelan rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," Caelan whispered. Clara let out a rough laugh, her hand still holding tight to his coat. "You just want my crop rotation secrets, Duke?" "I want your mind, Clara. I want your iron will." He kissed the corner of her mouth. "And, admittedly, keeping the water rights to the wire in the family is just good business." "It is," she agreed, closing her eyes and resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, rapid beat of his heart. "But I am not rebuilding the main house, Caelan. It is a waste of capital." "We will live here," Caelan said, wrapping his arms tighter around her, holding her against the chill of the night. "And we will farm Ashdown until we rule the north." "Deal," Clara said into the dark. The marriage settlements took longer to draft than the wedding took to plan. Caelan's solicitor, a thin, deeply traditional man named Mr. Penhaligon, sat in the Oakhaven library. He was sweating profusely despite the December draft rattling the window panes. He looked at the document on the desk, then up at Clara, who was sipping dark tea in a leather armchair opposite him. "You wish to retain independent ownership of the Ashdown deed?" Penhaligon stated, his voice tight with disbelief. "Lady Clara, this is highly irregular. Upon marriage, a wife's property is legally absorbed into the husband's estate. It is the natural order of things." Thomas Highsmith was the natural order of things, Clara replied evenly. She set her teacup down with a quiet clink. "And he nearly starved me to death. Ashdown does not get absorbed, Mr. Penhaligon. Ashdown remains a separate holding. The Duke of Westford will have full operational access to the River Wyre, as previously contracted. But the soil is mine." Penhaligon looked desperately toward Caelan, who was leaning against the fireplace mantel. Caelan was not intervening. In fact, he looked entirely too entertained. "Your Grace," Penhaligon pleaded, "this sets a dangerous precedent. It undermines the very foundation of the entail." "Draft the clause, Penhaligon," Caelan ordered, a sharp edge of finality in his tone. "She earned the dirt. I am not stealing it from her in a marriage bed." Penhaligon swallowed hard, dipped his quill, and began to write. They were married 3 weeks later in the small stone chapel on the Oakhaven grounds. There were no bishops, there were no dukes or earls in attendance. The congregation consisted of the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, Caelan's estate managers, and 30 of Clara's labourers, including Miller, who had worn a clean shirt for the occasion. Clara did not wear white. White was entirely impractical for a Yorkshire winter. She wore a deep forest green wool walking dress, tailored sharply to her waist, and a pair of sturdy leather boots. Caelan wore his charcoal riding coat. When they spoke their vows, their breath mingled in the freezing air of the unheated chapel. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a merger of two vast, ruthless empires, sealed with a simple gold band that Caelan slipped over Clara's calloused knuckle. Society, predictably, was horrified. Word travelled down to London by January. The drawing rooms of Mayfair buzzed with vicious delight. The Duke of Westford, the most eligible and fiercely pragmatic man in the peerage, had married the bankrupt widow of a degenerate gambler. "They say she works the fields like a common navvy," whispered Lady Jersey over tea. "I heard she sold the roof of her own manor to buy sheep," another matron replied, shivering in her cashmere shawl. "He must have taken pity on her. Caelan always did have a weakness for broken things. In February, Caelan and Clara attended the Winter Assembly in York. It was a calculated move, a tactical strike to silence the whispers before the spring planting season demanded their full attention. They arrived late. The assembly room was a sea of pastel silks, powdered shoulders, and glittering heirlooms. When the footman announced the Duke and Duchess of Westford, the music did not stop, but the conversation certainly did. Clara walked into the room on Caelan's arm. She wore the bronze silk gown from the harvest ball, devoid of lace, devoid of diamonds. Next to the heavily jewelled women of the ton, she looked severe, stripped down, lethal. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Clara felt the weight of 100 judgmental stares. A year ago in London, that weight would have crushed her. Now it felt entirely insignificant. She had stared down crop rot. She had faced eviction. The opinions of people who had never pulled a weed in their lives held no terror for her. Lord Croft, a notoriously arrogant landowner with estates in Surrey, intercepted them near the punch bowl. He bowed, though his eyes dragged over Clara's unadorned neckline with open condescension. "Westford," Croft drawled. "We were surprised to hear of your nuptials. You kept it terribly quiet. Though I suppose, given the bride's rustic recent history, a quiet affair was appropriate." Caelan's jaw locked. He stepped forward, but Clara tightened her grip on his arm, anchoring him in place. "Lord Croft," Clara said, her voice perfectly modulated, carrying just far enough to be heard by the eavesdropping circle around them. "I understand you had a difficult harvest in Surrey this year. Blight in the wheat, was it?" Croft blinked, thrown off balance by the abrupt pivot to agriculture. "A minor setback. The damp weather." "Of course," Clara smiled politely. "And yet you maintain a London house and 4 carriages. Tell me, how do you manage the overhead when your per-acre yield has dropped below £2? Do you borrow against the entail, or do you simply ignore the creditors until they freeze the accounts?" The silence that fell over their corner of the room was absolute. Croft's face turned the colour of a bruised plum. "My financial ledgers are hardly a matter for a ballroom, Your Grace." He spluttered. "A pity," Clara said smoothly. "Ledgers are the only things that tell the truth. If you ever require advice on liquidating your carriage horses to buy viable seed, do write to me at Ashdown. I have a great deal of experience in clearing dead weight." She nodded to him, turned and guided a stunned, fiercely grinning Caelan toward the dance floor. "You are going to terrify polite society, my love," Caelan murmured as he pulled her into a waltz. "Polite society is a parasite, Caelan," she replied, matching his steps with fluid ease. "They spend money they do not have to impress people they do not like. We deal in dirt, water, and wool. It is vastly superior." Caelan pulled her closer, ignoring the scandalous proximity for a public floor. "I have never loved you more than I do right now." By May, the River Wyre was broken to their will. The new textile mill rose on the Oakhaven side of the riverbank, a massive structure of red brick and slate. But its heart, the colossal 20-foot iron water wheel, drew its lifeblood from the deep, rushing channel on Ashdown land. Clara stood on the stone embankment, the roar of the water deafening. The spray coated her cheeks in a fine, cold mist. It was a masterpiece of engineering. The river surged through the diversion gate, slamming into the iron paddles, turning the immense shaft that powered 100 looms inside the brick walls. Caelan stood beside her, shouting over the noise. "The first run of flax is on the looms. The overseer says the tension is perfect." Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on the churning white water. This was what she had fought for. Not a title, not a rescue. This raw, unrelenting power. They walked away from the embankment, up the slope toward the Ashdown boundary. The ruined manor house was finally being dismantled. Clara had refused to rebuild it. Instead, they were stripping the remaining good stone to build proper, weather-tight cottages for the tenant farmers. The old gates were gone forever. In their place, a simple heavy timber arch spanned the drive. Practical, unbreakable. They reached the crest of the hill and stopped. Below them, the Ashdown fields stretched out in a vibrant patchwork of early green. The flax was sprouting. The sheep dotted the high pastures like scattered pearls. The land was alive. It was breathing. Caelan looked at his wife. She was wearing her old canvas jacket over a sensible cotton dress. Her hands were still bare, the gold ring catching the afternoon sun. She was looking at the fields with a hunger that he knew would never entirely fade. The fear of starvation had carved out a hollow in her soul, and she would spend the rest of her life filling it with harvests. "We need to buy the Miller farm new plows," Clara said, her eyes tracking a line of drainage ditches. "The iron on the old ones is brittle. They will snap before July." "I ordered them from York yesterday," Caelan said quietly. She turned to him, a flash of irritation in her eyes. "You spent Oakhaven money on Ashdown equipment?" "I spent our money on our equipment, Clara. The ledgers are separate, but the bank account is joint. Try to remember you are a duchess, not a besieged warlord." Clara let out a short, rough sigh. She reached out and took his hand, her thumb rubbing over his knuckles. "I forget sometimes that I do not have to fight everything." "You fought a dying estate and won," Caelan said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. He reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "You don't have to fight me. I am on your side of the river." Clara looked up at him. The cynical, hardened exterior she wore like a shield softened just for a moment, revealing the profound, exhausting love she held for the man who had let her save herself. She leaned up and kissed him, tasting the river spray on his lips. "I know," she whispered. They stood together on the ridge as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows over the Yorkshire hills. Behind them, the massive water wheel turned relentlessly, grinding out industry, grinding out wealth. Below them, the dirt was dark, rich, and full of seed. The world thought the Duke of Westford had saved a ruined widow. But as Caelan looked out over the empire they were building together, he knew the truth. Ashdown hadn't broken Clara. It had forged a queen, and she had built a kingdom from the dust. Wow, what a journey! Clara proved that true power isn't handed to you in a drawing room, it's built in the mud with your own 2 hands. Did you love seeing Clara and Caelan build their empire together instead of relying on a typical rescue romance? Let us know in the comments which scene was your favorite. If you loved The Estate Will Break Her, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow historical drama lovers, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more fiercely independent heroines and grounded love stories. See you next time.